Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a situation that's evolving incredibly fast. And it's tense. We're looking at the immediate global reactions after the United States' recent strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. We've gathered, well, quite a collection of international news reports, official statements, too, from various nations, global bodies, just trying to give you a real snapshot of how the world is responding to, frankly, a seismic event. Our mission is pretty clear. Let's unpack what happened, try to understand the different perspectives, and they are different, sometimes conflicting, and grasp the potential implications. Because this thing is escalating fast. The global political temperature is, well, it's rising. So let's dive deep into the world's response. All right, so first things first. What exactly happened? The baseline facts. The U.S. carried out airstrikes. The targets were key Iranian nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Now, the official U.S. line, their claim is this was necessary, preventative, to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons. But Tehran, they immediately called it an act of war. Simple as that.
And that difference is huge, isn't it? It's not just semantics. This immediate split in definition prevention versus war, it fundamentally frames the entire crisis right from the start. It means they're not even starting from the same page, which makes de-escalation, finding common ground, almost impossible from the get-go. That instant divergence really sets the stage for everything that follows.
Right, and that's where you start seeing the implications ripple out. Let's dig into the direct players first. Iran, their foreign minister, straight out the gate. Blatant violation of sovereignty. And a warning. Retaliation at a time of its choosing, which sounds pretty ominous. We're also seeing reports, the IRGC, that's Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, they've raised alert levels. And there are threats, direct threats, about striking U.S. bases in the region.
That time of its choosing phrase is key. It creates uncertainty, keeps the pressure on.
Definitely. Now, flip side. The United States. President Trump defended the strike, called it a necessary action to maintain global security. Strong words. But then, interestingly, the Secretary of State added a layer, saying the U.S. does not seek war, but they will respond to any aggression.
That's a really interesting duality, isn't it? How do those two statements sit together? It's probably, well, it's likely a very calculated approach. The president's message is firm, maybe for domestic consumption, showing resolve. But the Secretary of State's part, explicitly saying not seeking war.
Yeah.
That's crucial internationally. It keeps the door maybe just slightly ajar for diplomacy, even while projecting strength. That tension between those messages, that's the tightrope they're walking now. It shapes everything.
Okay, so we've got this sort of rhetorical clash right at the center. But like you said, the ripples. What about the immediate neighborhood, the Middle East? How did this land there? Well, Israel, for one. Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't wait long, welcomed the strike, said this is a strategic victory against a major threat. Unsurprisingly, Israel is now on high alert. They're worried about Iranian retaliation, clearly.
Right. A very clear stance from Israel. No ambiguity there.
None. But then look at Saudi Arabia. A bit different. Riyadh stressed the need for regional stability, called for an emergency Arab League meeting to talk things over.
That signals perhaps a more cautious approach than Israel's outright support, doesn't it? Riyadh definitely shares concerns about Iran, no doubt. But their immediate priority seems to be, stopping things from spiraling, averting a wider conflict, something that could destabilize their borders, and crucially, their oil infrastructure. It's calculated. Stability over immediate confrontation in this moment.
Exactly. And that caution echoes elsewhere in the Gulf. Qatar, the UAE, both urging restraint, warning about destabilizing the whole region. Turkey, though, took a sharper line against the U.S. action. They said it will only inflame tensions and hurt civilians. Quite critical.
And if you sort of step back and look at the bigger picture, you can really see how this one event just lit up a whole network of existing alliances, rivalries, the whole complex web. It really underscores that delicate balance of power there. Every player reacts based on their own immediate, often conflicting interests. It's definitely not a simple two-sided fight. It's this ripple effect through a very interconnected system where, self-preservation, pragmatism often comes first.
Okay, so that's the immediate region. What about the bigger global powers?
Further afield.
Russia, China. Russia came out swinging. Strong condemnation. Moscow called it an extremely dangerous move, warned it pushes the world closer to nuclear confrontation. Pretty stark.
Very stark.
Yeah. China, meanwhile, urged calm. Their statement was more about process. Military actions will only fuel the fire, and dialogue is the only path forward.
What strikes me there is how different those reactions are, right? Russia and China. Each one really reflects their own strategic priorities, their worldview. Russia's warning about nuclear confrontation, it's not just, empty words. It aligns with their goal of challenging U.S. unilateral moves,
Mm.
asserting their own influence, especially where they have interests like the Middle East, China. Their call for dialogue is, well, it's consistent with their usual approach, emphasizing stability, good for trade, good for their economic interests.
Makes sense. Two very different responses reflecting different global strategies. Okay, so what about Europe, our allies there? And the UN, the bodies meant to keep the peace? The UK, Prime Minister Starmer urged Iran to avoid escalation. Back to the negotiating table, France President Macron expressed deep concern, said Europe needs to lead on de-escalation now.
Interesting that Macron puts the onus on Europe there.
Yeah. And Germany. The chancellor called it a wake-up call. A wake-up call to revive the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, before it's too late.
Okay.
Pakistan also chimed in, expressing concern, urging diplomacy.
So a lot of focus on diplomacy, on reviving that deal, from the Europeans especially.
Definitely. And then you have the United Nations. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he didn't waste any time, called for immediate de-escalation, warned about the unthinkable consequences of full-scale war.
And I think the key takeaway, listening to all those voices, is this really consistent, almost a desperate emphasis on diplomacy, on de-escalation. There's so many different quarters. It just highlights this widespread, very real fear of a bigger conflict. It feels like they're not just commenting, they're actively pleading for a different path. Reflects a kind of collective global anxiety about how quickly this could spin out of control.
So let's try and pull these threads together, all these reactions, all these voices. What are the immediate, critical risks and the diplomatic pressures that jump out from what we've seen? First, obviously, the risk of a regional war. You touched on this. How could counterattacks from Iran-backed groups really blow this up?
Well, that's the nightmare scenario, isn't it? It's the core fear. If groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthi militias in Yemen start launching counterattacks, it could easily spark a chain reaction. This isn't just theoretical. It could pull Israel in directly, Saudi Arabia, maybe even other U.S. allies like the UAE, turning these initial strikes into a much, much wider, potentially devastating regional war.
And the economy. You mentioned oil prices earlier.
Yeah, that's the other immediate impact we're already seeing. The energy crisis is looming. Oil prices spiked almost immediately. Markets everywhere are nervous, bracing for disruption. And, when we talk about oil prices spiking, it's not just an abstract number. It's potentially people paying more at the pump very soon, businesses facing higher costs. It's a very real, very tangible ripple effect that goes way beyond the Middle East. It hits everyone's wallet.
Right, a global economic impact. And finally, the diplomatic side. The pressure is intense now.
Absolutely. You see, the EU, the UN, they're scrambling, rushing to try and revive talks. That phrase, before more missiles fly, really captures the urgency. I think it shows leaders are desperately trying to find some kind of diplomatic off-ramp because they recognize that more military action could trigger that awful chain reaction. We talked about regional stability, global economy, the whole thing.
So what we've really gathered today from this deep dive is, well, it's a snapshot of extreme global volatility. That seems clear. Marked by these starkly opposing views, but also this desperate, almost universal push for restraint. Understanding all these diverse, sometimes clashing international responses, it's just crucial, isn't it, for grasping the sheer complexity and the massive stakes involved in something like this.
It really is. And maybe this raises an important question for you, the listener, to think about. In a situation like this, where just one military action can trigger such huge, varied global reactions, what responsibility do nations have, to really consider the full scope, the full potential of those unthinkable consequences before they act?
That's a heavy question and definitely something to consider. It's a critical topic and it's clearly still unfolding. We really encourage you to continue your own deep dive into this story. Thanks for joining us.